It's time to enhance the relationship between expertise and impact, between knowledge and application. Welcome to a journey of discovery and empowerment. Welcome to All Physicians Lead, the Forbes Books podcast that highlights the critical leadership role that all practicing physicians take on every day. Here's Dr. Leon Morse.
My guest this week is Amanda Goodall, PhD professor of leadership at Bayes Business School in London, and author of the books Socrates in the Boardroom and Credible, The Power of Expert Leaders. Dr. Goodall's research shows organizations led by those with deep expertise in the core business tend to outperform those led by generalist managers. Her theory of expert leadership is backed by extensive data from industries in business, healthcare, universities, auto racing, and professional sports. Professor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're very, very excited, and I know our listeners are excited today too. Always like to start off with a little background. Tell us a little bit about your early professional years and how you ended up where you are today.
Well, I actually left school very young at 16. I didn't really get on very well with school. I was what we would call a military brat, so moved around a lot as a child, including living in America. And then, went into the fashion industry for a number of years and stayed in that for about 7 years, then lived in India, then worked in kind of campaigning politics, trying to change the world. Then realized things were a bit more complicated, so went to university. And then I'm in my early 30s, and then I did worked with leaders in universities, which is actually what created, from which I created my hypothesis, which I tested in university leaders first and foremost, and did my PhD around that. So having worked with these leaders, presidents of universities, and also a visit in Chicago too, I asked this question: who should lead research universities? Should they be good scholars fundamentally or good managers? And I found that those who were great scholars were associated in longitudinal data and in kind of just straight cross-sectional data. Universities were shown to improve the best when they were led by great scholars. And that started me on my road.
I notice in all of your photographs and in fact today that your background in the fashion industry has stayed with you. I'm always impressed by your style. Mine is incredibly boring in comparison, so I apologize I can't step it up to your level of the game.
Right.
But how did those early experiences shape your perspectives on leadership in the trenches, being led, being around the world in various environments?
Yeah, I mean, I think reflecting back, it's quite interesting because sometimes when you've discovered a pattern, sometimes you think that you noticed that pattern when you were young. You know, your mind plays tricks with you. And one thing I did notice in fashion was that people who, the kind of passion of people like Vivienne Westwood, for example, who I worked with a few times, the passion that she had, her ability with clothes, with styles, with all that kind of stuff, I recognized that passion, that deep knowledge definitely had an influence on the extent of their career. And of course, she was still producing clothes and fashion right up until she died just over a year ago. So, and also living in India, actually, again, the person who I worked with in India, and I was just volunteering out there, but he was passionate about what he did. So I suppose in that sense, if I reflect back, I can see that I was an early observer of those patterns. But to be honest, it's only when you get into the data and you start looking to see whether it really is generalizable and not just anecdotal that you discover, that there is something there. So yeah, I would say that it made an impression on me, and also often being the outsider. I was always the outsider because we were moving around all the time as a child, and that's also gives you an insight into things because you observe things differently. You're a slightly different person. You have to, make friends, all that kind of stuff regularly. So I think that was interesting as well. But on the leadership stuff, yeah, I definitely observed a few things when I was younger, but it wasn't until I got older and started looking at data that it all made sense.
Yeah, the generalizability, some of the data that you work on, particularly your experience with the Denmark data, is impressive. And we'll dive into that a little bit here. Your new book, Credible, covers some very exciting fields beyond the university work that you started out in: Formula One, the NBA, Premier League soccer, football, Did you get like free passes? You can do a hot lap with these folks when you're studying these. How much did you get into those spaces with your research? And did you get any special backstage privileges? That's fun.
No, to be honest, it's very so practical. So a lot of books on leadership, as you will know, are very anecdotal. And even though the field has been around for very many years, there's thousands of books on leadership, over 100,000 articles in the journal articles. But actually, when it comes down to it, how much of that is really generalizable, I think is very important. And the thing that I discovered was that getting access to leaders is quite a difficult thing to do. And and I did interview leaders for Socrates in the boardroom, actually. And that was great for throwing things up, for throwing up variables that I could then test or measure in different studies. But I think a very important part for me was really getting access to data and not having to get too close to the kind of subjects, if you like. So you don't get influenced by it in that way. So I can, and what it's difficult to do sometimes is to collect that kind of data. It's not necessarily always easily accessible. So the good thing about Formula One, for example, or Formula One racing cars, I think it's less known in the United States, but getting more popular, is that we could use 50 years of data because people are obsessive about sports and they collect these kinds of data.
They spend a lot of money on it, so the obsession is understood.
Yeah, well, that's true. But it's often it's kind of just supporters, it's punters that collect this stuff. But we managed to get 50 years of data, and so therefore we could test our hypothesis using that. And then another colleague of ours, I did a stint out at Cornell University as a visitor, and someone there, Larry Kahn, he's got lots of amazing data on sports managers. So we were able to put my hypothesis to his data of basketball coaches, and that's where we could find out the basketball stuff. So getting close, no, I don't get that close. Unfortunately, it would be nice to get close. I know that there was a while when some basketball agents were using our paper to kind of sell their great players as coaches. But no, I haven't really gotten that close. Now, of course, the hypothesis came from having worked with leaders in universities. So sometimes getting really close and seeing something that then you can go away and test is important. And that's kind of how I got introduced into medicine, actually. At the time that I came across the hospital pattern, I was just I'd done the basketball paper and I'd done the Formula One paper. I was looking around for as many data sets as I could find to try and test this hypothesis about core business experts. So, for example, the basketball paper was about how great basketball players go on to make great coaches. The Formula One paper showed that those who had the longest driving careers made the best principals in Formula One racing. And I wanted to carry on testing the hypothesis in different settings. So I found a data set, which you will know very, very well, and I came to know quite well, which was the US News and World Report rankings of American hospitals. And I basically did a very, very simple test. It's probably the most simple paper I've ever done. It was literally just a correlation. And I looked at, in 3 specialties, the top 100 hospitals. And I found that the hospitals that were more likely to be at the top of the ranking were more likely statistically to be led by doctors, by physicians, than by managers. And I guess what was interesting about that one was it was the most simple paper. It came out in Social Science and Medicine. And there've been lots of conversations and lots of discussions, lots of papers in medical journals about physician leadership, about the importance of physician leadership. But up until then, I think people hadn't thought about testing that and actually looking at whether physicians really were running good hospitals right now. So that paper sort of, in a way, kicked off a sort of literature which has now become much more sophisticated in its approach in looking at physician leadership. But it was a very simple paper, but it got a hell of a lot of coverage actually around the world, in many places on kind of blogs and newspapers and all that kind of stuff. But I think it was because it was the first time there was a study showing that actually great hospitals were being led by physicians, and it hadn't really been, I don't think, really been taken on board before. So that kind of started all of that.
So you touched on it a bit in this last answer. Thank you very much. But one of the things, just for our listeners who haven't had the opportunity to read your book, and I would encourage all of our listeners to read your book, Credible, that term expert leader in the various fields you've looked at, give us some clarity as to that definition and how you separated an expert leader from a generalist?
The way that I did it, or I started off, was really to look at what the core business was. So to ask what the core business is of racing, of hospitals, of universities, etc. And of research universities, it's particularly research is absolutely massive. So I would identify being an expert as being two things, I suppose. One is that you actually have had a career or have worked to quite a high standard in the core business. In other words, you're not an academic who did their research, who started off doing research and gave it up when they were in their 20s or 30s to go into the administration. You're someone who stuck with the research pathway quite a long way. In medicine, for example, it would be, if it was a physician, it would be a physician who would work as a physician for a number of years. In other words, people who give up their professional careers quite early are associated with usually less well-performing organizations. In other words, what you don't want is necessarily someone who was a bad doctor or a bad lawyer or a bad, researcher or whatever it is, who gives up and decides they're going to go into administration. That doesn't work out so well. But apart from having excelled, up to a certain level in your own field of expertise, it's also about experience. So those two things go hand in hand together. It's about having that kind of expert knowledge and deep understanding of the core business. So it's about having worked in the field, as experience. This is on average, okay? So it's not a specific science, you have to have done it for X amount of years, etc. This is on average. You perform to quite a high level, and you have therefore had quite a lot of experience of doing it. So if I was going to turn it the other way around, I would say you are someone who understands the core workers very, very well. You understand how to create the right conditions so that those people can work to the highest standard that they can. And I think that's why I really feel expert leaders are so important, either at the line manager level or at the organizational level, is that they can create the right conditions for people to really excel.
And perhaps nowhere better demonstrated than in Formula One and Premier League football. Some of the data that you show there says if you've won championships, you are then perform better as a manager or a crew leader.
Again, it's sort of, in sports, it's very contentious because everyone who's a fan thinks they know everything about sports, and there are always outliers, right? There's outliers in everything we do. Yeah. But the sports is not quite the same, although I would say it's the same. It's a very good test. Sports are really good areas to look at in research because in organizations, often they may have merged, they may have gotten bigger, smaller, performance may be manipulated. In sports, it's quite good because you either win or you lose, in very simplistic terms. So it's quite a good area to test it as well. I'm no expert I'm a Spurs fan in football, but I'm no expert in these sports. But I would say in terms of the organizations, what I have done is I've done a lot of work looking at the manager role and the importance of having a manager who understands, an employee's role, and also at the organizational head. And I think those two things are slightly different, but that's where I would say I'm more of an expert.
So I'm going to read a little bit from the book, again, encouraging folks to read it themselves. But when you talk about the mechanics of expert leadership, this was something that I felt really rang true, that expert leaders develop a clear sense of purpose. They take a long view. They really create productive work environments. They set themselves to perform at a very high standard, and that quality and developing new talent are extraordinarily important rather than quarterly investment reports. Talk about some of those things and what you've noticed in your research.
Sure. And I'd have to say, actually, just a little plug for another book, or Physician's Lead. No, but I've skimmed it. I'm going to read it much more closely. But there's a lot of synergy between what you do and what I've done, and a lot of emphasis on the developing of leaders, and a lot of the need for empathy and that kind of thing.
Well, thank you for that. That's very kind.
Yeah, no, and it's a great book. It really is. I haven't had enough time to really deep dive into it, but it's very good. So what we discovered, we've done, we've tried to get at this in lots of different ways, and we're quantitative researchers, we're not qualitative researchers. So what we've done is we've looked at different patterns. We've looked at databases that already exist. So 2 studies are focused on one particularly, where we looked at 35,000 British and American employees, 2 different databases, and we wanted to understand using job satisfaction as our kind of our measure of performance, employee job satisfaction. Now, why did we use employee job satisfaction? Because we know, and there's many experiments, there's all sorts of now different kinds of research studies showing that happy workers are more productive. And in some ways you kind of think, how did it take us that long? But the good thing is that we've got that evidence now. So we use job satisfaction as a way of trying to, as a measure of individual performance, because it's tied to performance. And we know that job satisfaction predicts retention and many other factors. And we looked at these data sets. We looked at the people who, basically there were data that already existed, and we used them to discover that those people who explained that their line manager, their immediate boss, had either worked their way up in the organization or started it, and was deemed as being technically competent by the employee, or the employee stated that that person could do the employee's job. In other words, they really understood it quite well. These were the people who reported the highest job satisfaction and retention rates. That was really important for us. And we found in that study that job satisfaction, your job satisfaction is so influenced by your boss. Your boss is actually worth double your pay to your job satisfaction. In other words, the quality of your boss matters more than your pay to your job satisfaction by a significant extent. Now, if we think about that logically, it makes sense. Who is the person that decides whether we can, go on and develop in our careers? Who puts us up for promotion? Who even tells us when we can have our vacations? Bosses control our lives to such an extent, whether it's we want to work from home, whatever it happens to be. So in a way, it makes complete sense that the boss is very important. Now, what I would argue is that the organizational bosses set the kind of standard for organizations. There was a great quote that I got from a guy called Patrick Harker, who used to be the dean of Wharton Business School. He went into banking after that, but he said to me, and he's a really talented scholar, and he said, the standard bearer must first bear the standard. In other words, if you're at the top of an organization, if you're a physician at the top of an organization, and you're telling everyone they've got to, they've got to be great doctors, they've got to improve, etc., you better be pretty good yourself. And so I thought that was a brilliant quote. And that has, certainly in the stuff that we've looked at, many studies now, we found that to be true. So I guess we're talking at 2 levels here. We're talking at one, the line manager level. We now know that we have a lot of information to know how, and we've got new data that we're looking at in the NHS, actually, National Health Service, showing how important your line manager is. It's remarkable. The strength of the line manager effect is so strong, and on things like job satisfaction. And we know that it's the behaviors of line managers. We've got a number of behaviors we've been able to uncover. So if your line manager understands what you do, if they can support your career development, if they can contribute to your sort of, your working day in terms of helping you advance what you do. Basically, a number of criteria we've looked at that show us that if you've got a line manager that really understands what you're doing in your job, they will help you create the right conditions for you to succeed. And that's ultimately, in a way, as an employee, I think that's all we want. I want my head of department in my university to just let me be the best I can be in my role. And I think that's true of all of us. And only someone who really understands what I do could possibly ever do that.
Yeah, retention is a vastly underappreciated cost or reward for that type of leadership. And, we often don't see that on the balance sheet, but it costs us, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to replace an employee who leaves. And in the current job market, certainly here in healthcare, there's a lot of mobility that's available to team members. And the old quote, people join organizations but leave bosses, is very telling in that realm. But in addition, any work that you've done or seen that is also correlating that manager to the environment of care, the workplace culture. All of those things can tend to be good or bad, and then ultimately in our business influence the patient's experience. If everyone in the clinic is happy and things are buzzing along and the boss is really supportive of that entire team, then that influences the environment. And my belief in this is that it also impacts the willingness of the patient to go along with the plan of care. If they're really confident that this is a great team, they're going to believe us and participate in their healthcare journey. Any thoughts on that?
That's so interesting because, I mean, you will know better than I do, and we definitely have lots of evidence to show that things like leadership development for physicians and for other clinicians, etc., are linked to patient outcomes. We know, obviously, there's lots of studies looking at organizational leadership and employee commitment and patient outcomes. But I think you make a really interesting point about it's not just about patient outcomes; it's sort of about the patient engagement with the clinician, and that's fascinating. I haven't thought about that before, actually, and that's really fascinating. But certainly, I mean, in the UK right now, retention is a massive problem. I would say the UK is in a pretty bad place, worse than it's been in a very long while. Politically, the public services have been really run down, and the NHS is in a bad state post-COVID. The waiting lists are phenomenal, and usually the NHS can do pretty well and stand up on its own against most health systems. But I would say it's really running behind in terms of its particularly European comparators. And retention is a massive issue. And lots of junior doctors and trainee doctors are leaving to go overseas, actually. They're going to Australia. They're going to many other places. So there's this kind of reshuffling of doctors going on. And one of the studies that we're still working on with NHS data and looking at is very much about staff retention. That's what it's going to be. And it absolutely shows, and that will be the title of the paper, that yes, people don't leave jobs, they leave bad bosses, essentially. And that we found that absolutely. And this paper is going to be all about retention and about whether they want to leave immediately, whether they want to leave, in the next year, whatever. But it's so strong. And I'm not surprised, of course. It doesn't look at expert leaders because they don't have that in the data, but it just looks at managers, and both managers and senior bosses. And we find exactly the same thing. Senior boss or the manager are strongly correlated, and this is longitudinal data, with an employee's desire to leave the organisation. So I think for us as well in the UK, and I think also for you in the US, in Britain, most CEOs of hospitals are general managers. They are not clinicians. They don't work in medicine.
Vast majority.
Yeah, and in the US, I think that's the same probably as well, except for, of course, the outstanding places, Cleveland Clinics and the Mayos and various other places that you will know better than me.
Well over 90% are non-physician.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I do think that's a problem. I really do think that's a problem, actually. I think with the patient care emphasis of clinicians is one thing. But I also think, I think in this country, I would say doctors have been somewhat emasculated even, actually. I think they've been sort of pushed down in some way. Now, some people will say they're quite arrogant, all the rest of it. And of course, that's why in your book, in my book, we talk about things like hubris and about wanting to train people in leadership development. And I'm sure we'll go on and talk about that. But once you can do all that stuff and you give them the same leadership development that nurses have been having for the last 30 years, they can become brilliant leaders. And we know this. How do we know this? Because I have got 70, doctors on our courses data from their line manager and from themselves talking about how they've used their leadership development in advancing, health provision and being better doctors. So the evidence is all there, but I still think there's resistance, and partly that might be because people of the hierarchy and the kind of some of the politics of it, but also a lot of people in this country think, keep the doctors seeing the patients. We haven't got time for them to do anything else. And of course, what they don't realize is that actually they're cutting off their nose despite their faces. If you've got a doctor who is a great doctor, you can also run a department really, really well, or a hospital really, really well. That's going to get through many more patients. So,
well, we know that it takes anywhere from 15 to 17 years for class 1 clinical data to become in widespread use. So there's definitely going to be a lag between some of your great data and implementation. If we can't do it with heart medicines, it's not going to happen quickly with selection of chief executives. One of the things that people will ask is it sufficient to have expert leaders on the senior management team as opposed to as the chief executive?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. And in terms of the data, I've shown that the people, on all the studies I've got, they're CEOs. They're not joint CEOs. They're CEOs. And other studies that have looked at healthcare more deeply and in a better way than I have actually, have also had them as CEOs. Now, there's a lot of discussion about having a top team with your COO, your CEO, and your chief nursing officer, or sometimes a joint CEO. And there may be, I have not studied that in any detail, partly because the numbers are actually quite small. So why didn't I do the study that I do in the UK that I did in the US? Because there are so few hospitals that are led by doctors, so I just couldn't do it. In a similar vein, I think that there's not that many hospitals, I think, that have joint CEO positions, although there may be increasing numbers between a COO and or a manager and a clinician, say. That there's probably some around, but I haven't done any studies on those. I think one of the things that I would say, I'm sure there are a number of examples with people who are very capable and who work really well together, and they can jointly lead an organization. I also think that at times, with a lot of us mere mortals, that's probably quite a hard thing to do. And I think one of the things that we discuss quite a lot in our book, and I'm pretty sure you also touch on it in yours, if I remember, is about how you sort of have difficult conversations, how you make decisions about your staff, et cetera, and that's quite a difficult thing. Sometimes we want someone to take, to be there, to be the backstop, to let who picks up the shit when it hits the fan. And often I think there's a reason why there's one person, because that having, the dual nature of that can be quite difficult. Having said that, I'm sure there are organizations that make it work. I would say, when it comes to clinicians as well, there's quite a few nurses now who've taken on CEO positions. I think nurses can do it more easily than physicians because they are able to train in leadership and management way earlier than doctors are. Partly because many of them in America, for example, I think are actually employed, whereas the doctors aren't necessarily on full-time contracts. I believe that's part of the problem. But certainly in the UK, they've been doing training for years, and they start very early on. Whereas in the UK, there's very little training for doctors in leadership and management. And if there is, it doesn't start till very late. So one of the big issues is trying to introduce it at undergrad level, you're smiling. This is obviously brought a lot about time, right?
The key factor in the book to get that idea that physicians are leading at the medical school level from very, very early on, and recognizing the impact that physicians have at those manager levels very early on in their career, just running a clinic, running a team in the operating room, running a team in the trauma bay, the ICU, you are leading. And the current connotation over here is that physician leader means someone with a business card who has a department title or a CMO or CEO title. Those are physician leaders. Whereas the reality is, as soon as you put on the long white coat, you're influencing behavior to achieve a desired result, which is the core definition of leadership. And the fact that we're not explicit about that with our young doctors not only prevents them from reflecting on that core competency with the intent to improve, but also gives up 5, 10, 15 years of learning to lead better because you're not focused on it, which would, in result, create better organizational leaders when you moved into those, because you've been thinking about your leadership style, practicing, getting feedback, and improving long before you get into those business card positions. So I'll get off that soapbox, but that was the big grin. That was a big grin when you said it.
Yeah, well, no, but it's that's what I love about your book. It's the fact that I mean, and other people have kind of said that, but not in such a great way that you have. That yeah, they already are leading, absolutely. And as soon as, and one of the things that they talk about the trainee doctor in this country is already carrying the responsibility for patients way before other clinicians are doing that. And so they may be in a team with other people, but the buck stops with them, even though they're still training and they're still young. I mean, as you say, they start to lead, absolutely. And that needs to be incorporated very, very early on. I think what's interesting about it as well is it's the way we talk about leadership. I mean, there's been all this sort of obsession with leaders and leadership and in a kind of way that, which is why I quite like using managers sometimes, because I think we need to kind of take some of the ego out of it a little bit. And what you're talking about though is that, yeah, that they're taking responsibility essentially very, very early on, but they don't have the tools to help them do that, which makes it much, much harder for them. So, I mean, we're just merging my university with another university, which is St. George's, which is a medical school. And we'll be very engaged in talking about exactly this, about training the doctors in leadership from the very, very start. And it may not be leadership, it may be behavior. I mean, one thing I think you and I agree on absolutely is in the course that I run for doctors, we're now just about to enter recruitment for our 8th cohort. But it was hard to set it up, actually. There was a lot of resistance to it. And if I'd have waited for the NHS to give me their blessing, it would never have happened.
You know how many faculty it takes to change a light bulb, right?
Well, yes.
The first thing that you have to do is they all say, change? Nobody said there was going to be change. So, getting a university or the NHS to change their way of doing things is something we've all run up against,
That's true, although in the NHS there's been more change than than light bulbs, that's for sure. I mean, it's been unbelievable. Government comes in, they change again. Now, I think it's more sinister than that. I think there was actually I'd have some OD people saying, your course is only for doctors, that's elitist. Oh, really? That's elitist? Even though doctors do have a slightly different role than anyone else in a hospital, and other professions have had their groups. I mean, really, it was extraordinary, and that I had to work quite hard and develop a thick skin to get through that. But the reason we set up this program exclusively for physicians was because I wanted to create a safe space, actually, so that they can really turn the lens on themselves and really critique themselves. They can, really get into the details of it. And I didn't know this at the time, but I thought, maybe it was another hypothesis, that it would be more difficult for them to do that with other groups in the room. And I wanted them to really just sort of take their gloves off and just get down to brass tacks about things. Now, when I say that, we have lots of diversity in the room, every single specialism. We have different age ranges, different positions, all sorts of things in terms of, so there's very diverse. But it has, and it's proven to be true, I would say. And I wouldn't say that every single leadership program they do in their career has got to be with doctors alone, but I think it's definitely made a point. It's definitely proved its point, I would say. And now even the NHS is thinking about doing, some doctor-only training. I mean, it's amazing. It's kind of spread around a bit. But I thought it was important. And just to your point, going back to your book, the first module of this course is basically holding up a mirror to them. That's the very first thing we do. It's all about personal leadership development. It's all about their behavior. Because I say in a sort of light-hearted way, we can give them all the skills for strategy, business planning, health analytics, all you want. But if you behave like an asshole, then it's just not going to work. So we try and deal with behaviors first up. And I know that you talk a lot about that in your book as well.
Yeah. It's, and some of the pushback that I have gotten, gentle, giving lectures on this topic and now with the book, is that, well, physicians aren't always the boss. And when you attach that term lead, that's part of the implicit understanding there. And what I've said is, no, the definition that we're working with here is influencing behavior to achieve a desired result. And in fact, everybody on the healthcare team is doing that. The scrub technician in the OR the nurse in the clinic, we're all doing it. I write about physicians because that's what I know. And I can sort of open the kimono and be very blunt about some of these vignettes that I talk about and put in the book. But the fact that you're influencing behavior to achieve a desired result is exactly what you just said. You can come up with the best written plan that any organization has ever seen. It's not going to get executed unless you are able to influence behavior, positive and sustainable way. You can get away with it for a little while. And unfortunately, we forgive physicians some bad behavior because they're clinically productive, technically excellent, and under a lot of stress. True, all of the above. But I think we can definitely do better because there are other professions where you're also in life and death circumstances under a lot of stress. You need to be highly technically competent, fighter pilots. My military background is opportunity to look at that lens and say, when the spaceship is blowing up all around them in, Apollo 13 and almost certain death, someone gets on the microphone and Lovell says, Houston, we have a problem. Just as calm and flat as you can be. You could get every surgeon in every OR to act like that. We'd perform better, I guarantee it.
Exactly. And I think it's, again, the military thing is very interesting. I have a PhD student who's a former American fighter pilot, interestingly enough. And also we had someone on a doctor's course a couple months ago who was the Surgeon General of the Canadian Armed Forces. And what's interesting about the military, I think, and I do cover this a bit in the book, is that how much further ahead they are in leadership training. And of course, the more I read, which I did for the book, reading much around my little small area, and I hadn't realized that actually the whole leadership training all came originally, management all came from the military, from the Romans on forward. You probably know this very well. But it is interesting. I mean, it's not that there are problems in the military. There are often with behaviors and stuff. But actually, from day one, I mean, one of the things that my PhD student is working on with looking at the Space Force is that they immediately step in. They've just come out of the kind of graduate education or undergraduate education. They step into the organization and they're already learning about how to manage a team. That's because they are already managing a team immediately. And it's very different. I mean, we could learn so much from looking at that, and all of what you say about training, offering this training to medical students, essentially. The military's been doing that, haven't they, for years, and you will know better than most.
Well, thank you very much. It was definitely a great career, and I learned a lot. You mentioned the Bayes Business School's Executive Master's Program for Physicians that you developed and now lead. I definitely want to explore that in more depth, but we have to stop here for now. So coming up next time, Dr. Amanda Goodall, Professor of Leadership at Bayes, will share some advice for physician leadership development.
I mean, one of the things that was said actually to me by a former heart surgeon, CEO, he said, if you care about patients, then if you step back and take on a bigger responsibility, you're going to have a much bigger impact on patient care, patient outcomes, even than you are at the one-to-one level.
This has been All Physicians Lead. We can all be better leaders, and our teammates and patients will be the beneficiaries. Go to allphysicianslead.com to unlock your potential, sharpen your impact, and elevate your journey. All Physicians Lead with Dr. Leon Morse is a production of Forbes Books.